The October 7th attack on Israel caused a seismic shift in the political landscape. Certain factions of the woke mob finally began to care about the hateful rhetoric towards so-called colonizers, while at the same time, the leaders of the anti-woke mob immediately reversed their stance on free speech, and Jordan B. Peterson repudiated his own life's work without even a pause for reflection. So how do we keep track of the pathology that we sometimes call woke as it shifts skin suits? Identity politics has been the go-to branding of the beast, but is not the West itself an identity? Can we have a Western nation without Western individuals? And how is that identity negotiated? How is it broadcasted and reflected back in our day-to-day cultural activity? I put together a pseudo dialogue with some speakers you may be familiar with to create a framework for discussing this in a meaningful and productive way. And please don't take any of these as owning the other. All of these perspectives need to be integrated. I've included Brett Weinstein, Jonathan Pageau, and Orthodox priest Father Stephen DeYoung. While analyzing the facts of the 10/7 attack, Brett Weinstein came to the conclusion that what is happening is not what it seems. He then described our enemy, humanity's existential enemy, as Goliath.
Took a long time to realize, but I find very important, is that what we are facing in this complex environment, I call it Goliath. Goliath is the force that opposes meaningful change.
He describes this as once a person, but now an evolutionary force. That's fine if that's your worldview, but humans have been documenting these things as powers, principalities, and more for millennia.
And so the way to understand it is that there are patterns in the world, and that there are true patterns, just things that manage reality. You can understand it scientifically if you want. You have these patterns that exist in the world that are kind of legislating reality. And the way that many of the ancients saw it, is that you can grab those patterns in order to make yourself stronger.
It also has a part that's emergent, right? People who realize that they're going to be stigmatized if they think one thing, so they think another, and then they reinforce each other. Or journalists who accidentally discover that when they write stories that look like this, they don't do well, and when they write stories like that, suddenly, their quality of life goes up, so that they don't know why they're writing those stories, but something is paying them indirectly, something that they will never meet.
So you grab patterns in the world that you see, and then you use it to increase your power.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a sense in which once you've done that, then those patterns have a will of their own, you could say. And they have a reality which is beyond your own personal will for why it is you did that in the first place.
What came to mind for me was the idea of giant clans in the Old Testament, which brings us to the most unsettling verses in the Bible, the atrocities against babies. I don't know if Brett Weinstein was thinking about these when he decided to name an existential threat to humanity Goliath, but the entire pattern applies here. The idea that some entities are so heinous that they must be eliminated without thought or pretense to ethics. Replacing the word witch, or racist or fascist, with giant is not useful. I'm not proposing another label to make our enemies seem darker and us brighter, but we have to understand what we have been doing here.
We have to take Goliath out. We do, because, frankly, I think we have two choices for history. We can either return to lineage against lineage competition, or we can all step into the cosmopolitan future and we can retain our traditions, but we can stop suspecting each other and prioritizing each other based on our genes, which is something, if you understand how ridiculous it is to let your genes decide who you should like, then it would be preposterous to allow lineage to dominate our world.
Weinstein describes our problem as the crux between two ways of approaching civilization, lineage and whatever the hell the West is. He describes Israel as having a foot in each world and says it needs to make a decision. I propose that the reason we have made so little progress on this issue and seem to be backsliding, perhaps out of existential necessity, is that it is formulated completely wrong.
So we have to take a few steps back and question those basic presuppositions about the world, right? So is what we're talking about, first of all, in Joshua, are we talking about ethnicities, right? The concept of an ethnicity as it exists today, the concept of DNA, right, didn't exist. And what made people part of a certain people group, whether it was Israel or whether it was one of these Canaanite groups that are called giant clans in the Old Testament, what made someone part of those groups was determined ritually. So what made you an Israelite was not a certain ethnicity, was not sort of you traced your DNA back to Abraham somehow without science. It was that you had been circumcised if you were male, or you were married to or the daughter of a circumcised male, and you ate the Passover. Because doing those things put you into a relationship with the Israelite community and with God, with the God of Israel. Right? And so now there's this community includes God. You are now a part of it. Right? And those relationships between you and God and you and the rest of the community are part of that order of justice.
Brett seems to think you can pick whatever cultural traditions you want, so long as you don't care about skin color or DNA. Public intellectuals speak as if traditions are merely comfort food. Can you truly be a Westerner by faith alone? Or do we need to put a candle out for the founders? Perhaps we do have tradition and rituals, but they are as invisible to us as water is to a fish. Critical race theory advocates will tell you the same thing. Whiteness to them has nothing to do with DNA. They have told us that this whiteness is created by upholding certain values through habitual, ritual behaviors, like being on time and doing your homework. They have also created rituals for taking on the counter-identity, such as pronouncing white, as if you were about to hawk a loogie. What is a good Western ritual that we can agree on? Take this viral story.
This is a free country. You can wave your Palestine flag and say Jews or America whenever you want, but we can put a sign.
Most would say these men are acting on values, Western values, and that statement is factually correct. But how did those values become instilled in these men? What are we doing when we praise and share this video? I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it is a DNA-level meme of the American identity, the most compact story, the for sale baby shoes never worn of the hero's Western journey. It is a participatory story that explains and rebinds who we are as a people. Every time you share a story like this or act one out, you are participating in the rituals that give birth to the West. The word religion itself is likely derived from the word religare, legare, bind or connect. Without a continual renewal of our spirit through these rites, the Western spirit degenerates into a revenging ghoul of its former self. Reality is made of stories, including stories about atoms and quarks. Those that understand this are casually creating and destroying our stories, like a hunter might set out a wooden duck or drive a herd off a cliff. The rituals we see performed most often in the last decade have been the rituals of wokeness, or perhaps communism, but getting too caught up in those labels obscures at least half the picture. I promise you, pathological behavior existed before Karl Marx was born. Surely some of those that participated in the arguments resulting in martyrdom or orthodoxy lied like AOC. Or do you assume that those whose followers skinned their opponents in the street were too holy and high-minded to act out what you call communism? Call it a color revolution all you want, but pro-social idols were destroyed by the youth in your founding story too. The creation, destruction, and reformation of sacred cows has always been central to cultural activity, and destroying brittle ideas that fail to describe the world is not in itself an evil act, but there is something more sinister going on. A force that holds itself above our petty squabbles is cynically destroying our most cherished models of behavior, our stories that let us get along. This ritual not only takes away our tools, but its very method of theft traumatizes us and leaves us looking to lash out against our mirror reflection. Not only are we less capable of conceptualizing a more holistic worldview, we are left with a black and white mentality that's based in self-reinforcing violence, or at least rejection of personness, if you don't like words being violence. With that understanding, there's a new definition that includes wokeness but also its successor: weaponized narrative collapse. Declaring an unresolvable situation resolved by projecting complete pathology or irredeemable evil onto some side or identity in the situation. You may think I'm just reiterating the meme here. Winners, losers, communism, etc. But we can't just call it communism because that doesn't account for both sides. And if your eyes are rolling at both sides, please take note that the Super Free Speech Club just called for the silencing of their political opponents. We can have a nuanced or complex understanding of a situation, but never a complete or perfect one. The openness nags at our minds and draws off mental energy. We must accept or repress this lack of closure in one manner or another. If you lower yourself to a clear solution, then all of that psychic pressure is released. The sword of Damocles has fallen and now it's in your hand. You are awake to the problem and others are going through life as if asleep with no knowledge of the subject. You can take pride in your secret knowledge and lead others in the ritual beliefs that will reinforce this new base story with you in the ritual lead. One might cynically profit off a story, pretending he is acting out the ideal more authentically than he is. We call this corruption, we call it the hypocrisy, and refine our understanding. This is not what Goliath is doing. He sees himself as an entirely different species, and to him our stories, including science, are nothing more than mating cries to be emulated with a whistle. The woke mind virus has been the most obvious tool used by this entity in recent history, but it's also too easily identified. The net is far more insidious than that. We must search for patterns of patterns, not the trappings and trinkets of spent slave forces. For an example, we'll look at classic university feminism. It takes a complex array of gender issues and potential dangers and flattens them all out with the declaration that men are predators. Every complex social situation, such as men and women together in the workplace, starts from that determination and is adjudicated from there. If anyone threatens your power, simply wield the sword. Believe all women. The red pill dating community is the most obvious mirror. More complex is the idea of being politically red pilled. If you're even contemplating Goliath, you're most likely woke or red pilled to the idea of a deep state. And here I am guilty. I inevitably reduce it to something less complex than it is, and I think of it as cartoonishly evil. I think that's unavoidable. Anyone can collapse into NPC thinking given enough stress and a complicated enough subject. It's easy to blame the feminists, but why was this such a civilization-wide force? Some have speculated that it has to do with a centuries-long push to reduce the price of labor and workers' bargaining power, untangling this obvious financial interest from the legitimate grievances of women and the repeating cycles of history and the human spirit seems to be an impossible cognitive load. Then what path is available and bearable? The path of least resistance would be pinning all of this on some identifiable ethnicity or identity. The Enlightenment approach has been believing that faith alone, and the opposite, will save us. So how do we tackle the problem differently? We know the giant is out there, but we cannot see the violators that are implanting his embryo in our minds. How can we know friend from foe if we do not even know ourselves? What thoughts are rightfully called your own? Have you learned 1,000 signs and symbols to be afraid of? Or have you trained questioning like a kung fu kick 1,000 times a day? I plan to re-examine this pattern through a variety of frames, from neurodivergence and attachment styles to church history, idols and holidays and all that, so you can see it happening within yourself. Please like and subscribe so I can take on the ritual identity of YouTuber and keep making videos. Thank you. Please share.